and a few more people joining in. So hi and welcome everybody to today's webinar on varietal honey production. We are very excited to be live streaming from Deep Gap where James is, and I'm in Boone, North Carolina, and the weather actually allowed it, so we were able to have a little live walkthrough as part of this webinar. I'll hand it off to you first, James, to get started and to introduce.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks, Max, again for hosting there in Boone and running the show. I'm here, as Max said, in Deep Gap, which is, there's no town Deep Gap, it's just a location, which is pretty typical for a varietal honey production yard, right? So my name's James Wilkes. I'm founder and chief beekeeping officer for HiveTracks. Founded it about 13 years ago and been keeping bees for about 23 years. So sourwood honey production has been about 15 years. So anyway, it's great to be with you. Glad you could join us and looking forward to just talking about honey production in general, but varietal in particular. So Max, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I just saw that Leanne even joined here from Northern Ireland, so it's great to see a fellow European tuning in. It's a lot later in your day. My name is Max Runsell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of HiveTracks. Been the CEO for about 2 years. I have a background in rural development and food and resource economics. I worked for the UN for 2 years, where I got to know James on a conference. And yeah, ever since we've been working side by side. And we're very excited to bring this webinar to you today. So let us quickly jump into what we're going to be talking about before I hand it off to James and we start with the actual content. So again, we'll be talking a little bit about a honey production overview, talk about local nectar sources and how we can determine what a varietal honey actually is, how much the timing and weather conditions are relevant, how we prepare the hive and the colony for the honey production, what the sourwood honey production in particular looks like. Again, that's the varietal honey that is local to the area here in Western North Carolina and a couple surrounding states as well. And then we'll have a live yard observation where James will actually go in and take a look. And he told me that the flow is still going on and the weather is good, so that will be a lot of fun. And then we'll have some Q&A at the very end. And of course, at any time, feel free to enter your questions in the chat. We try to answer them on the go or leave them at the end. And then we'll also put our email addresses in the chat. So if you want to reach out and have a particular look. Of course, in the background here, you'll see our app that we just launched this year. So we've been live since mid-February. We're very, very eager to hear everybody's feedback. We just had a big update this Monday coming out. The top request we've received was from beekeepers to be able to order the hives, for example, and quickly rename the hives. So we've addressed that. And yeah, we're only just getting started. We'll talk a little bit more about other things we have on the roadmap later today. But at all times, we're very, very eager to hear your feedback. So please reach out, tell us what we're not getting right yet, but something that we can improve to provide better technology for hobbyist beekeepers as a starting point. All righty, James, I would say, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Max. I'm going to take my veil off here. The bees are pretty chill this morning, meaning they're still working the flow. And as Max said, this is pretty informal. We want this to be more of a conversation and not just a one-way. So as we go along, if you have a question pop in your head, feel free to put it in the chat or jot it down and ask it later. And I'm going to suppose a little bit that from the previous webinar where I was talking about honey production in general, and a lot of concepts there apply for varietal honey production. So some of these slides will go more quickly through, and if you want more background, feel free to go and look at that other webinar. It's available on our YouTube channel as well. So first, let's get some definitions. What does one mean by varietal honey? And you can see in this picture, I have our sourwood honey there on the left, and on the right are different honeys that come out of our bee yards throughout the season. And it turns out that at least 2 of those in that lineup could be considered varietal honeys. The far left is a basswood honey, and I think the far right is probably the sourwood. But varietal honey is the name given to a honey that primarily comes from one monofloral source. Okay, so again, we're assuming you know how honey is made. It comes from the nectar from flowers that are blooming in the forage area. So if you have one single source of nectar going into a honey, then that's considered monofloral, single flower, unifloral, as opposed to multifloral, which is a lot of different nectars going into it. Now, we as beekeepers know that you can't control where the bees go. So the trick and the question is from consumers that I talk to at the farmers market is, how do you keep the bees from going to other flowers? And the answer obviously is you don't. Okay, so you set up the conditions to leverage the bees' natural behavior and timing, et cetera, which we're going to talk about, so that you end up with what you can call a varietal honey. There's the definitions around honey and labeling and all that are pretty murky and fluid, and nobody has a strong definition. So just keep that in mind, and don't over stress about whether yours is a varietal or not. I wouldn't stress over it, except to recognize that you have the possibility of having varietal honey even in your own operation if you're a fixed hobbyist beekeeper, and we can talk about how that might be the case. All right, Max, next slide. Participate here. Do you have a favorite varietal honey? Pop it in the chat if you do, or one that's in your particular area. If you've been beekeeping in an area, you might have a variety. Okay. Tupelo is one that I kind of put up there with sourwood. It's a bit mysterious, and it's a bit of a challenge to try to get really good Tupelo honey. Fireweeds from Alaska, acacia, some places, or black locust, some places have a lot of that. In our area, not so much. It's kind of a specialty if you can get it. Orange blossom buckwheat, list goes on and on. And really any flower out there could produce a varietal honey if you just got the nectar from that one flower. In your particular area, as we've mentioned before, you're going to have certain flows, certain flowers that are blooming. And if you have an abundance of one particular flower, then that's going to be stronger in the honey profile of what honey you make. So again, all honey is actually, a mix of different varieties of flowers. But if you have a predominant nectar source, then it sort of becomes a varietal at that point. And why do we distinguish varietals? Well, it's because one, they might fetch a higher price at the market, or you just like that particular flavor profile, and people want that particular flavor from that honey, much like your wine or craft beer, things like that, where there are different varieties that matter to people. Okay, all right. So, I threw in a couple of international ones there. Manuka is the big one from New Zealand, and we could have a long webinar probably from that, and what it means, how they ended up with that. And then the cider honey from Yemen is another kind of international high-end varietal, I call it. You can have varietals that are low-end or high-end depending on how abundant they are, right? How rare is something makes it cost more or not. It's just market economics there, right? Okay, Max, let's go to the next.
In the chat here, we have Sandra's favorite varietal is the basswood, and then Richard mentions that I may butcher this name here, mesquite and cotton honey.
Yeah, mesquite. That was Texas, I think I saw. Yeah.
Parts of Texas.
Yeah. And again, you could have any sort of nectar source and be a varietal honey. Now, look at the background of this. You might recognize it as canola or rape. And if you have hives next to this, if you ever have hives next to this, you know how much nectar is produced, and it's just copious amounts of honey can come from that. And so it would be a varietal, but it would not be a super valuable varietal just because there's an abundance of it. So again, the top level question here is, what nectar sources are in my honey? We all ask that question about the honey that we're collecting. It's a very obvious answer, and I'm not being snarky here, but just keep this in mind, okay, that you can't have something that's going to be outside of your forage area or outside the list of flowers that bloom in your forage area. So again, there's no need to stress terribly over getting somebody else to tell you what's in your honey. Just look around. You are the one that lives there. You're the one who knows what's blooming. And so you will know what the potentials are for the nectar source in that honey. And so what is blooming in your area? How do you know that? Well, it's pretty obvious in this picture. When you're driving down the road, there's these fields and fields of beautiful canola. But just look around, okay? And keep records. So with HiveTracks, we have a what's blooming record that just when you notice something, just jot it down, put it in the app to say, this is what's blooming right now. And again, collectively, we then begin to have a great library of what's blooming in different areas. And there's a lot of folks who are very interested in knowing what that is. Local knowledge, ask the other beekeepers in your area and yourself, okay? Once you've been keeping bees in an area for a certain length of time, you are gonna know kind of what blooms, what the flow is in terms of the beekeeping season. If you haven't been there before in that area, there are other beekeepers who do know that thing, and don't shortchange that local knowledge. That is a valuable piece of the puzzle of knowing what's in your honey. Now, going beyond the beekeeping realm, we can look at other data sources. And we've talked about this before with HiveTracks, and HiveTracks, again, is very interested in the beekeeping data and then other data sources that augment and give us even more information about what's going on with bees. So land use maps, like in the United States, USDA records, things like that. Satellite images. Google has really revolutionized the availability of satellite images to us with Google Maps, and other mapping companies now have plenty of map data that you can look at, and it gives you what the possibilities are for blooming in your area. All right, Max, next. So we always get the question, again, of what nectar sources are in my honey. And today I'm in a sourwood yard. Actually, that little stack of boxes right above Maple Springs there on the bottom, that's where I am, okay? And these green lines, you can't really see it very well from this image. I'll have one later, but this is really the sourwood band along the Blue Ridge Appalachian mountain chain where I am. And those 3 yards these are concentric circles around these yards showing 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 mile radius where your bees are going to be foraging. And so these 3 yards that are in those lines are our sourwood yards. And there's obvious reasons why those are our sourwood yards. And again, it's the location, and there's not much else blooming in the neighborhood when the sourwood is blooming. And the other things that are possibilities, and you've probably heard Bob Benny and others who are in varietal honey production talk about this. What are the other flowers that are competing with the bees for their services as nectar and pollinators? And in this area, we've got Japanese knotweed is beginning to invade a little bit. It's not too much. And also got sumac. Some of these are mimosas, more of an invasive, but it's along the road edges and things. So one of the things you want to do if you're going to get varietal honey is you can't control your forage area, but you can control where you put your bees, right? So you want to get your bees into an area that's optimal for your varietal honey production. And that's what we've done here. And I'll tell you a little bit of history about that when we get to that, of how I even landed in this spot. All right, next. Now, beyond your knowledge, your understanding of where your bees are, utilizing data sources around your apiary locations, people want to say, well, what about lab tests? What about third parties? What about others that can verify what's in there? And first off, I would say these are all useful in helping to validate what's in your honey, but they're not the definition of what's in your honey. You and your location and the forage in your area is what defines is in the honey. So all these tests have their gaps and places that blind spots, if you will. So all that to say that the collection of all this information gives us the correct image of what's in your honey. So flavor profile itself. Sourwood honey has its own unique flavor profile. That's one of the things that distinguishes it from others. And actually all honeys do that. And so you can taste.
James, I think we lost you there for a moment. Are you coming back? Let's just give James.
Yes.
Yeah, you're back?
Okay. All right.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just start again. We just lost the last 30 seconds. So.
Okay.
Good.
A little burp there. Okay. So honey sommeliers can discern the different flavor profiles. And you don't need to be actually honey sommelier. You can just taste your own honey and you'll be able to discern over time the different honeys that you have in your area. And you'll begin to notice the flavor profiles that you have. What about lab tests? Okay, so a lot of people want to go to lab tests, and one of the reasons that lab tests are prominent is it's an integral part of honey imports and exports. Okay, it's a barrier, if you will, to help deal with adulterated honey or contaminants in honey. We haven't talked a lot about that, but if there's heavy metals or antibiotics or things like that in honey, you don't want that getting into your food supply. And so there's a whole host, and I just quickly did a Google search. You can do the same thing. All these little screenshots here on the bottom are different labs in the US or in the US that do honey testing, and they use different kinds of technologies, and they're continually trying to get more accurate and different kinds of tests. The primary reason for that, or one of the main reasons for that, is to circumvent the honey adulteration.
James, you're breaking out again. We may not be as lucky as we were last time with your internet connection today. Let's give James another minute to see. You may want to turn off your video for a moment, James, to allow a little bit more bandwidth. Let's just hope he comes back. Well, I'll take over. You're back, James. Do you want to turn off your video to allow for a little bit more bandwidth? I'll just unmute you real quick.
It's not the bandwidth, it's the heat.
Okay. So the weather is too good.
My phone was sitting on the hood of the car and the car was still warm.
Okay.
So I'll put it in the shade. Are we good now?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so I think we're good on this. Let's go to the next. So this is a slide from the last time. Every place that you keep bees has its own typical pattern of honey flows. One of your jobs as a beekeeper is to understand what that is and to learn that. Okay, so wherever you are, as you go through the season, again, keep records, talk to people, and learn what the nectar flows are, what the nectar sources are. So next one. Now, varietal honey production, as I said, it's just another form of honey production. There's nothing magical about varietal honey production, except that we are trying to limit the nectar sources that are in our honey. So from a management standpoint, we're going to do things to do that. And the things we can't control, like weather, play a much bigger role when we're trying to make varietal honey. So you see here in the middle, there's a temperature gauge that's June 25th with a 48 Fahrenheit temperature, which is not a real good temperature for making honey. And on the left and right, you see radar images of rain, and rain is not a friend of honey production in general. And in particular for sourwood honey production, we can get some big thunderstorms that come through this time of year, that can damage the blooms, that sort of, or just keep the bees from flying. Okay. The satellite image there on the right, that looks like a big front coming through, right? A big change in the weather. And for sourwood honey production in particular, we like it just hot and steamy and, just really warm and not big changes in weather. So that's not what we want to see during sourwood honey production. And so again, you need to pay more careful attention to the weather when you're trying to make varietal honey, and it's going to impact. Last year's sourwood season was cut off completely by a big front that came through and dropped the temperatures and just cut off the nectar flow. And maybe that's a good time for a little aside. Nectar flows from particular flowers have their own sort of pattern, and it could be based on nighttime temperature, daytime temperature, time of day. Buckwheat in particular flows in the morning, but not in the afternoon. And so even there's nuance within the flowers that are blooming that may or may not flow at a particular time based on weather conditions and that sort of thing. And around here in North Carolina, one of our big spring nectar sources is tulip poplar. And those blooms sit up like little cups. So if it rains, the nectar just gets washed out. And then you need a few days for it to recover. And then the bees can start collecting it again. So again, there's a lot of nuance there that in general, if you're just looking at a whole season, aren't that important. But if you're going for a varietal honey, it can make or break an entire season. So, all right, next one.
Maybe one question here, James. Like, so how many weeks, what is the sourwood window? How many weeks do you have? And how does altitude play into that?
Oh yeah, I'll get to altitude in a minute, but the flow for sourwood in particular is about a 3-week window. Okay, and that's from the beginning and we have scales that kind of verify this. And you could monitor close enough in the hive, but the scale just demonstrates it from the first nectar that starts coming in and giving us a bump to when it tails off. It's kind of this S curve that you get on the scale. But for sourwood, it's 3 weeks. Others, it can be shorter or it can be longer. Again, depends on the nectar source. That's local knowledge that you need to, understand. All right.
And the 3-week window also explains why weather is so crucial, because if you have a cold front coming through in just 3 weeks,
yeah, when you're in that high production window, and we can talk about this more when we look at the scales. If you're getting a 5 to 10 pound day of honey production, just start subtracting those out. Your dollars add up pretty quick from a honey seller retail value wise. So yes, it's super important. So this next set of slides are all review for you. If you weren't here for the last webinar, go back and look at these. The main point of this is the preparation for the hive preparation for varietal honey production is exactly the same as varietal honey hive preparations for regular honey production. You need strong hives when you go into these locations. And so all the normal things you need to do to get your hives ready for the varietal is the same as for regular honey production. Now, for us, that means and we're moving hives. So there's a little bit different timing than if you just have a stationary hive. So some of these things you can play with, in terms of how you get your hives built up. For example, sourwood doesn't start until the end of June. So what we're doing in April with our hives, we can split. We don't need them to be big and strong then. We need them to be big and strong in the middle of June. So we can do things in April that we might not be able to do if we were just stationary. So
here's one quick question. I'm going to go to the next slide. Here is one quick question about how much does sourwood honey sell for per ounce?
yes,
Down here in Texas, for regular honey, people get 1 to 175 per ounce.
yeah. So for us, it's $20 a pound in our local market. So that's a little more than $1 an ounce. Just regular honey across North Carolina. Regular meaning wildflower, multifloral is almost $1 an ounce. So that sourwood's actually pretty economical in that regard. But online, it's even more. Go look at, I don't know what Savannah Bee Company is selling it for these days, but that would be a good measure of what the full retail might be. Yeah. Okay. So these are all the things that you can do to get ready for the varietal honey production. And again, I'll make note that that picture there on the bottom right is in Saskatchewan, Canada, where they make, if they don't make 300 pounds per hive, then they consider it not a really strong year. And they just stack supers to the sky in those cases. All right, next one. Okay, so I'm going to circle back a little bit to sourwood honey production in particular. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my story. So we're, about 30 minutes in. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and we're going to take a little journey on my personal journey. I moved to Creston, North Carolina, which is in Ashe County, the western part of Ashe County. If you look at a map of North Carolina, up in the very top left corner, that's where I am. I'm 20 minutes from Tennessee and 20 minutes from Virginia. And at our home base yard there in Creston, we're actually making basswood right now. And when I moved to that area, there was a man down the street or down the road who kept 50 to 75 hives. And clearly I got to know him as we started ramping up our bee operation. And it turns out that he was into sourwood honey production. He had been doing it since the 1950s. He had bought 2 pieces of property. Actually, that little stack of boxes in the middle top of this picture, that's a little piece of property that he bought in 1950 something for sourwood honey production. Okay. And so I started learning sourwood honey production from him, when to move the hives, where to put the hives, those sorts of things. Do not discount local knowledge. Okay. Leverage it as much as you can. That just means being friendly and talking to people and having relationships. Okay. That's what we all ought to be about in the beekeeping community. But I learned a lot from this fellow. And when I started doing HiveTracks and I started drawing these maps with the forage radius, okay, back in the 1950s, he didn't have this, but what he did have, he knew where honey was made. He knew when I put hives in this location, I make a lot of sourwood honey. Well, it turns out the satellite image confirms that that is a supremely good location. The whole forage radius is in the forest and is in sourwood country. So it was just a nice convergence of like old school observation and the new technology that's around. So and so from that point on, he and I shared yards. And unfortunately, he's died since I started. And he was just a character. I loved spending time with him. Find people like that in your community. They're a treasure to be around and hang out with. So again, location is super important. You can see kind of in this satellite image as well, the darker green. I don't know if you can see it on your screen or not, but kind of the darker green, like I had in those green lines before, that's the downslope of the Appalachians. At the top is probably at 3,000 feet. At the bottom, it's about 1,200 to 1,300 feet. And in that range is literally the sweet spot for sourwood honey production. And we can go up the Blue Ridge Parkway is a icon around here, and you can drive down that parkway. And when you look out over the bottomlands, you can see the sourwood trees all in the top of the tree canopy, which shows that it's a great location. Max, you asked about the elevation and latitude. So I just mentioned elevation. So at my home bee yard, like I said, in Creston, it's 45-minute drive to here. It's about 1,500 to 2,000 foot elevation change. It's only about 30 miles, maybe, as the crow flies. Okay, so that close. There's zero sourwood honey made in my home location. It's all basswood. And then between there and here, I follow the whole elevation of sourwood bloom. Okay, so as I drive down the mountain, I can see it. It's just started blooming at the top. And down here, we've probably got several days, maybe a week left. Okay, now if you follow that band of green on the satellite image, from upper right to bottom left, then you're changing latitude. So you're going further south. And the further south you go, it's further along than it is further north, right? So your elevation and your latitude are going to influence, in this particular case, sourwood, because we're in a mountainous region. Those changes are going to have an impact on when the flowers bloom, which has impact on when you put bees in a particular spot. Okay, so here's one of the very important nuances with varietal honey production, and that is getting the bees at the right place at the right time with the right configuration, strength, etc. So I want to move my bees into these locations within a few days of when the bloom is going to start. Okay, and we pretty much strip off any honey that was produced prior to that time. So there's a little window that's pretty challenging. You don't want much food there stored on the hive before that next nectar starts coming in and they produce your varietal honey. So that's a little game that you have to play and be mindful of. If the flow doesn't happen, for example, your bees could be starving in a varietal honey production yard. That's happened once in my history of this location in particular. And so the timing is, again, super important. And knowing those nuances in your area. If you're in a flat, hey, you Texas people, mesquite, I don't know if it has just wherever you are in the mesquite area, it's going to be the same, However, I would argue there's probably a little bit of climate variation or even weather variation, clearly, that's going to have an impact on that. And even here where I am, when I was driving on the highway, you can see the sourwoods down the side. On the left-hand side, they're south-facing. On the right-hand side, they're north-facing. The blooms on the left were further along than the blooms on the right. So again, that's just going to stretch out your season, with those flowers. In particular with sourwood, it has these fingers and the blooms go from the base out to the tip. And so you can kind of judge how far the flow is by how far the flowers have bloomed along those little fingers. Okay, so, all right.
We have a few questions here.
Sure.
Just to intersect real quick, we have one question on the carrying capacity estimation on a per hectare basis to the sea in terms of what's the carrying capacity of a particular foraging area. And
right.
Then we have a question around when moving bees, do you close up at night before moving, or do you move during day or night? And then just one clarification that the mesquite does vary here as you go west and drier and hotter and higher. So it's
there you go. Yeah.
Elevation.
Yeah. So to the moving question, we used to close them up, but we don't anymore. And moving here in the middle of June, you've just come off a spring flow. And so there's lots of bees in the hives, and just think about this. We're pulling off honey supers, smashing all those bees down into a single or maybe 1.5. So there's a lot of bees in there, and to get them all back in the hive on a hot, steamy summer night is super difficult. So we've kind of just moved them without, putting screens on them, and it works fine. And what was the first question, Max?
The carrying capacity.
Oh, the carrying capacity. Yeah, so carrying capacity is a very interesting question, and one that's hard to get a specific answer to, partly because you get such a wide variation in general. Maybe canola, maybe there's some nectar flows that are just kind of pretty regular and standard. You know what you can expect. But in some of these tree crops like sourwood, there's so many variables that, I mean, we've stacked hives into this yard. You know, actually, right there's, I want to say there's like 50 or 60 hives in this yard right now where I'm standing. And all the hives are still just doing as much as we would expect them to do for this time of year. So that kind of tells me we haven't reached the carrying capacity, but definitely that's something to consider. And if you have options of spreading them out, then obviously you want to, you know, do that. I think, and some of that could be determined by how many hives you can fit on a truck. I mean, literally, that's I know in some places like in Canada and others that's part of the equation. It's less the carrying capacity of the yard, and it's more of logistics and that sort of thing.
And also, I mean, your carrying capacity, James, as well, is like, given that you're in a forest where there's plenty of foraging sources. I think that's another component where carrying capacity is more relevant when you look at the land use and the land cover of a particular apiary. Are you more in an urban environment? Are there reasons to be there is a limitation in the foraging area, whereas when you're in a complete forest, and you can see from the satellite imagery, it's a very, you know, it's an unpopulated area basically where the foraging availability is just higher.
Right. And so, for example, in you know, in this satellite image, you can see kind of, if you get outside the mountains a little bit, you probably still have sourwood trees, but your density is going to be less. So definitely, if you just looked at that image, your carrying capacity would be lower by definition, right? The question is, do you ever reach the limit, the edge of your carrying capacity? And in the places we are, not that we're aware of, but it's, again, something to consider. All right.
One other question just came through here. Is it okay to offset supers to allow bees in and out easily without traveling through the whole hive during a heavy nectar flow? Or is this a problem which could lead to robbing?
So two pieces to that question, and I'll start at the end. If you're in a heavy nectar flow, robbing will not be an issue. So that's point number one. If robbing became an issue, it means your nectar flow is over. Okay. And secondly, I see plenty of people who do the offset or do an upper entrance. We prop our tops up a little bit as well, but I haven't noticed any difference in particular in doing that. Meaning I don't see anything wrong with it, but yeah, whether it adds to your honey production or not, I don't know the answer.
All right.
All right. So this is just one of our production sourwood yards. We live in a beautiful place. And this is probably towards the end of a sourwood flow, which is kind of like we are here. And even in that picture, you can see some variation between the hives. And maybe that's another point to bring out here is no matter how much you try to even up your hives and things, you're still going to have some variability between the hives themselves in terms of how much honey they produce or not. And I kind of turn it into thirds. It seems like it happens that way, that a third of them kind of don't do much, a third do what you would expect, and another third do over the top more than you would expect. And so just know that there is, even if you have like one hive in a particular location, you don't know which one of those thirds it's going to be in. So again, the more hives you have, you kind of begin to see, you can average out kind of what's going to happen in that location. So if you want to test out a location or test out the honey production in an area, put several hives there. That's the best test, right? To decide whether you're going to get honey production out of a particular area, and varietal honey production in particular. I know in North Carolina, and there's probably several of you out there or who will watch this who kind of monitor the sourwood flow, and some of you bring your hives off the mountain, you know, I call it off the mountain, into the sourwood territory. And so you're all the time kind of watching and trying to find a good location to put those bees in to make sourwood honey.
That's great. Yeah, I have another. Richard just asked a question that I like a lot because I had a very similar one in the beginning. So he asked, in sourwood country, are your hives typically in an open area like the photo, or in the actual trees?
I prefer full sun myself, but some of it is just the locations that you have available to you. Okay, given that we want to be in forest, that's where the nectar sources are. There are a few fields and things like that where you can have your hives in the open, and I prefer that. The yard that I'm in is not what I would if I drawn out what I want in a bee yard. This would not be it. There's a little stream right next to it there. Even in the mountains, and think fresh flowing water. It's almost a swampy sort of area. It feels like it's just a low line, and but man, for whatever reason, it's a really good sourwood area in spite of those sort of things that you would not think are a good bee yard. So either one works is the answer to that. If you've got sourwood in your area, it doesn't matter where you put your bees, they're going to make sourwood honey. Yeah. All right. So again, these are all, slides from last time. And so we are going to go get in the bees real quick, take a quick look at them. And while I'm doing that, yeah, Max, you can talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So these are slides while James gets veiled up and connects with his phone so we can have a quick look. Again, I'm just going to go over these slides real quick. So these are a few additional information that we talked about during the last webinar, so feel free to review them. We had looked a bit how like this scale, this picture of a scale where you can see in particular how the honey is increasing with these slight decreases in the morning when the bees are leaving the hive. And here is just a quick overview of what it looks like in our app, where you can actually record the honey harvest, which is particularly relevant when you want to compare it from year to a year, like when you were harvesting. So this is what it looks like in the app. For those of you who haven't checked it out yet, clicking on the little home button here allows you, I'm letting James in, allows you to set up the records. So there's any records, as James was saying before, on the document flora, for example, so being able to keep track of what was blooming when. And then when you click on the honey harvest icon here, you're able to select the location that you harvest the honey upon. This is my little test hive at Cecil Miller Road, where you're then able to also collect like how much honey are you taking out of the hive. So are you doing 10 pounds or coming from a metric continent in kilograms, but even in frames or in terms of supers that you're collecting. And then always adding a little bit additional information for what was foraged, and then a few pictures of what you've done. And this really helps you to understand when year on year, I mean, specifically when we talk about varietal honey production, and we only have the 3-week window, it's really important to see what did I do the last year around this time, how early was I, specifically when we talk about, you have this short window where you have to move in the hives in a particular order. How do you make sure that you keep track of that, specifically with a changing climate that we're seeing as well, right? Where we kind of one year fluctuates from the other, and we expect these fluctuations to increase in time, then it's particular importance to keep track and build your own knowledge, right? So you can relay back to what you've done, and also to be able to compare it. So to be able to get a good understanding and be able to share with people in your area, hey, this is what I did, this is the history of management practices that I performed on the hive that led to the honey harvest. James, I just allowed you to unmute yourself. I think you should be good.
All right. Okay, so you're going to put my video on there. All right. So this is one of my friends, very good friend, that I'm sharing this bee yard with, or letting him be in this bee yard. And I don't know, you can see the trailer here. This is a popular way that a lot of folks from not in the area bring their bees in. And I'll just show you, these bees are flying up and out of this canopy right here. And they're flying okay. It's not super warm yet, and they're just getting geared up. There's my assistant, Oliver. And let's go over here to, these are our hives. And this is different than last time. There's a bear fence here now because we lost a hive here. It was on the end to a bear, which we've never been hit in 15 years in this bee yard by a bear during sourwood flow. Now we've been hit by a bear here before or after if you leave your hives in it too long. But as far as, you know, during the season, no, until this year. So we had to quickly get a bear fence up. You can see how many hives we have here. So it would be a great loss to lose those hives. So this is one of the scale hives. Now you can see down here, you simply push this button and then I Bluetooth the data over to my phone. And what I saw on this when I came into the yard before we started the broadcast was that we've been in 5 to 6 to 7 pound days for the last week and a half or so. And I talked about thunderstorms and the impact they have. Given we're in a mountainous region, if you're in humid air, then you tend to have thunderstorms almost every day. And so that's a big risk to us. We like the hot and humid weather, but it also brings the chance of thunderstorms to us. And so I'll just take you around, show you a few of these hives, and then we're going to pop into one. Some of these are singles, which means they're duds when we brought them in. But the others that have the stacks on them are making honey. And again, they're beginning to fly pretty good right now. Let's pop the top on this one over here, Oliver. And we're going to look for some of those signs that we talked about for nectar flow. All right. I think this is a super that was just added a couple of days ago. So we're going to pop down one more in here. And that's what you want to see. So Oliver, come over here, and so you see the white edges along here. That's what you're after, and you're looking for your honey flow. You can see these have already. Let's pull one of these out. You can see the bees are still pretty chill. Means they're still on the flow. So you can see this is pretty well capped all the way out to the edge. So they're wrapping this up in this particular hive. I don't know if y'all can see that color, but on our honey here, the sourwood honey in this particular area, it's a kind of a dusty brown color is what I describe it as. And so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to taste it.
The one thing Zoom hasn't invented yet.
Very good. Very good.
We have one other question here, James, in the chat, or two actually. One on the weight. I think we can look at that in a minute when you share the screen again. The other one is your Ina asked, we have been encouraging our beekeepers to construct apiary sheds. How your colonies are tolerating the intensive rainfall during this period, which I think rain has the impact of decreasing the colony productivity. What's your comment on that?
Right. So yeah, that's not a bad idea. And actually, one of the trailers that one of my buddies used was a horse trailer, which is enclosed. And yeah, it does that. It protects it from the elements and that sort of thing. So
yeah, and then James, here's another.
We can't do that here just because of the the volume of hives that we have and that sort of thing. So
we had another question from Marty, who looked very carefully and noticed that there were 9 frames in a 10-frame box. Is that normal for you?
Yeah, so generally in honey production, you will run at least 1 fewer frame, maybe even 2, so that the frames will be fatter, and that helps extraction a lot. We run 10 frames down in the brood. So most of these are single deep brood chambers. And so we run 10 in those, but once you get above the brood, we go to 9 frames. Yeah.
Right. Super. Then one other question, this was Richard's asked, in the weight graph, are those peaks the bees arriving for the night and leaving? What about the little bumps in between?
Yeah, so the bumps in between can be various things, okay? And that's where you need additional data sources to interpret bumps or knowledge of the bees themselves, okay? So if a rain shower comes through, all the bees, or a good portion of the bees that are out foraging, flood back to the hive, and you get a little spike in the weight. Now, depending on how long that rain is, it might stay flat for a little bit until it passes, and then it goes back down when they exit the hive. So generally it's weather related, the little peaks. It can also be hatches of bees out when they go out in the afternoon to fly, or maybe even more is drone exits in the afternoon, okay? And so think about how are you going to get a change in weight on a hive. It's either bees coming or going with more or less weight when they come and go. Or is there something being added to the hive? Is there an animal that gets on the hive, or when it rains, it actually absorbs some moisture, or it puddles on the top, things like that. So there's only a certain set of things that can cause a fluctuation in the weight, and it's going to be one of those.
I remember when you sent the picture of your cat sitting on the hive. that showed
In the winter, every morning I would get this bump in the morning, and the cat was hopping on the hive for a warming up.
All right.
So that's it from here. I did just one more report on the flow itself for the beekeepers out there in the area. The blooms look like they're still blooms, that have a little ways to go. I'm at about 1350 elevation here at this location. And as I said, as I went up the mountain, there's still some bloom left up there, although I have heard reports of less production at kind of the middle elevations, but don't know if that's going to hold or not. And so we're expecting, again, another several days at least for these lower elevation yards. So what else you got? We can go back to the Q&A.
Yeah, we're just a few minutes to the top of the hour, so I wanted just to give everybody a chance. Any last questions? Of course, you can always reach out at either max@hivetracks.com or james@hivetracks.com if you have additional questions, or you would like to see more. We will be sending out the recording of this as a YouTube link as well. But feel free to leave any final remarks in the chat. And then also already, James, thanks so much for doing being live in the bee yard and taking on the sweaty task of inspecting the hives under the sunny weather. Let me unmute you. There you go. You should be good. Yeah, you're unmuted, James. Yeah, no, and thanks for all of you for the great questions. Oh, Richard is asking here, how is the scale powered, if it's solar charged or regular battery?
Yeah, that's a great question. All manner of power. So different versions of the scales, different generations of the scales have had different sort of power mechanisms, and I've kind of used all of them. This one here had a special lithium battery in it. I've got another scale with NFC that uses like a half AA battery in it. So
that's awesome. All right, yeah, so thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We are going to get a few more webinars in this season, as long as the honey flows is on, or the beekeeping takes part. So
well, one note, we got a couple of minutes left. Yeah, this is pretty much the end of our season in our area. This and the basswood, and then we'll be going straight into winter mode. These yards will get honey pulled and treatments put right on for varroa. And I think this is true for most of us, unless you're in Canada, they'll still be producing and harvesting for a bit, but it's amazing how fast the season goes, right? I mean, you feel like you're just getting it going, and then wait, it's time for winter again. But that's the way it is.
Yeah, and thanks, Richard, for the question. So to upgrade the app to have the recording ability, yeah, I'm happy to. If you send me an email, we can take that offline. I'm just going to put my email in the chat here. And maybe, you know, we have 2 more minutes. So there's one very quick question or very quick thing I wanted to show. If you can see my screen all right, this is something, if you can see the honey profile. So this is something that we are working on at the moment. And of course, everything that James was sharing now to see, keeping track of the data of your hive in particular, and showcasing what you did when you harvested the honey allows us to provide a profile of your honey, right? So this is the first step of a so-called data-driven authentication, proof of origin, if you will. So this is something that we are working on at the moment, and we'll release in smaller parts toward the end of the year. Whereas James was saying, most of the relevance to where we are and what we do is based on our observations, the data we record in the app, how we manage our hives throughout it, and we basically craft the story of the season by the interactions we have with the hive over time. And capturing that in a digital format and visualizing it allows us to put all of the information. This is one that we did for James's yard in the sourwood, with even the honey profile, which you can access through a QR code or an NFC tag on your honey. So yeah, we'll be sending out a lot more information on this towards the end of the year. We're actively working on this, but this is part also of why the record keeping is such a relevant part of it, because it effectively it tells the uniqueness of the varietal honey or of a particular honey production, as you have to be in the yard, taking care of the yard in the right order to be able to describe the uniqueness, which tells a very relevant story behind the origination of the honey.
Yeah, and that reminded me of one other thought, Max, I wanted to share and emphasize with everybody is do not shortchange your own input into this process. As far as validating your honey, we're the best sensors in the yard. I mean, our taste, our smell, our vision, the actions that we're taking, don't outsource, the validation of your honey to technology. The technology is going to assist you as the beekeeper. You're the one who knows your honey, your operation, and you should be part of the process. So that's really what kind of the heart of what we're at, is keep the beekeeper in the equation. The technology is great, but it's just an assist, and it's a vehicle for carrying this information out to the consumer is what I'm after.
Phenomenal. Thank you. Thank you so much, James. That's it. Now we're at the top of the hour. Thank you, Ajinberry, for the question there as well. Please, we are still working on the Arabic translation and the Amharic translation. So the Amharic translation will be available in Ethiopia. And if you could send me an email as well, Ajinberry, I'm happy to follow up, and we can talk about the steps when we can get the Amharic version of the app live in Ethiopia. So thanks a lot. Again, thank you all for participating. This was a lot of fun. We'll be back soon with another webinar, and you all have a great rest of your day and happy beekeeping. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.